today's tutorial I'm going to paint a mountain scene that includes trees and sort of grassland as well, and more in the foreground. The app I'm using is Procreate on the iPad Pro 2 12.9 inch screen, and I've already pre-selected a color palette in Procreate, and if you want to use these exact colors you will find the hexadecimal codes down in the description, and all you need to do with these codes is to type them in to this particular area on Procreate. You'll have a hexadecimal code area here, a box, and you just type in the codes that I've made available and then just place them into the palette area here, and you'll be able to follow along and accurately reproduce the kind of effects that I'm going to be showing you. In terms of the brushes, I'm going to be using just the airbrush, so I might use the range of sort of soft, medium and hard airbrushes, but it is all going to be in the airbrush. Just to show you, on the airbrush I'm going to reset it to default, and I'm going to use all the brushes in their default setting. So there's nothing complicated about the brushes at all. I've opened an A4 canvas, and if you do all those things then you're good to go. So the first thing I'm going to do on my first layer is I'm going to create the kind of sky for the background. So as I showed you, I've got some pre-selected colours. I'm going to go for the first blue colour, and this is largely going to be the sort of top area of the sky. I'm going to have quite a large brush, and I'm simply going to cover a large area in this base colour. I'm going to take it all the way, or almost all the way down, but I've got two blues selected here, and I'm just going to turn the opacity down on this, maybe the brush size down slightly as well, and I want to start gently introducing a slightly lighter blue in here as well. So I want it to be darker at the top and then sort of fading down a little bit. I've done quite a few landscape and sky tutorials. They definitely have some similarities in terms of how you structure them. This one's going to be much more a kind of daytime, a bit of a lighter tone than some of the other ones I've actually done. I've done quite rich colours, quite dramatic scenes in some of my other tutorials, and this one is a bit lighter in tone, a bit more daytime, a bit sunnier perhaps. So that will do for the background. If you decide that you can see perhaps some, because of the digital manner of the medium, sometimes you do just see slight steps in the blending. If you wanted to get rid of that, you can just go on Gaussian blur and just turn it up slightly, and you'll find that it blurs it in. I'm not going to do it too much, because actually some of those slight textural kind of lines that you see appearing in the transition is the kind of thing that you might see in a sky area anyway, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to create another layer on top. So now on this second layer I'm going to go to the colour I've pre-selected here. Now it's not quite white as such. You can see here that it's a blue, almost the kind of indigo area, and it's not right on the edge, so it's not a complete white, but it's very bright. So I'm reducing the size of the brush to be quite small for some distant, smaller clouds in this really pale colour. I'm just going to start putting in some forms first of all, see where we go with it, and then I'll start to build the effects and the different kinds of colours that would need to be put in there to make them fit the landscape. So I'm keeping the kind of movement quite circular. Sometimes you want to do clouds that really sort of stretch out across the sky, but these are going to be quite small, and they're also going to be quite rounded in shape, quite kind of fluffy white clouds. Maybe turn the size of the brush up a bit actually to get some of the bulk shapes in. Can always go over these and sharpen up some of the forms and edges. So I'm going to have some of the larger clouds higher up and maybe a little lower down. They're going to reduce in size, mainly because the more foreground clouds tend to be higher up in the scene, and then anything that approaches the horizon is going to be more distant kind of clouds. Having said that, you may get in the distance sort of larger banks of clouds where they all merge together a little bit, maybe in areas, so I could feature that too. But anything that's in this area that is a unique kind of shape is going to appear as a smaller kind of version in the distance. I think I'm also going to create just a bit more broken kind of texture in the top area here. So you can see some of the deepest blues coming through, but just perhaps just not have it quite flat looking. Maybe down here as well it can start to join up again. What I do now want to start doing, however, is reducing the size of the brush and turn the opacity up and really begin to sharpen up some of these edges. This is where the actual sort of features of the clouds are going to be more apparent. If you notice on my colour palette, the cloud colours, the sky colours are largely speaking the top three colours there. That's not to say that I won't use any of the other colours in the sky, because I may wish to form sort of like a shadowed area of a cloud. So I may well even use this particular blue that is roughly speaking for the distant sort of mountains, but I might well use that colour in the sky as well, just in areas where I want the cloud to look sort of solid and have a bit of a shadow. But just for now, I'm going to give the edge of this cloud a sort of highlight and a stronger edge. So I'm varying the size of the brush depending on the size of the cloud. So if it's a smaller cloud area and I need to really have a more precise, sharp edge to it, then I'm going to reduce the size of the brush. In fact, I'm going to test out exactly what I was saying. I'm going to go for this colour here, which is mainly for the mountain area, but it's the same kind of colour I may introduce or I am introducing for the actual clouds as well. So just in areas, I was going to turn the opacity down. It perhaps doesn't need to be too strong, but I'm just going to test out the idea that some of these cloud banks have a bit of almost kind of solid mass to them. They don't, not solids, but have a real kind of weight to them. So they have their own shadows. So not only is that going to make them feel more substantial, have their own shadow, but obviously then the contrast better with the background as well. I don't want to go too heavy with this though, because I don't want to turn it from being a sunny sort of scene into a storm clouds or rainy looking day. So just being a little bit sparing with these shadows. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the white colour. I'm going to really do some smaller sort of bits of cloud here in the distance, like I was saying earlier. So I've got some of the bigger shapes in the foreground, but I'm just going to make sure I've got some sort of broken texture in the distance as well. I may well decide that some of this is obscured by mountains and other features anyway, but not quite sure how I'm going to arrange the land and the mountain forms yet, so I'm just going to enjoy doing this aspect first. Like I said before, when you get to more distant clouds, sometimes they join up and almost form sort of streaks across the distant sky. I don't want to do too much of that because I want the sky to look quite open and quite blue. Okay, I'll leave the sky for now. I will come back to it at a later point. I do like to refine details like that later on, but for now I'm going to move on to the next layer. I'm going to go to the colours that I've got pre-selected as it happens. I have been using this colour already, but I'm going to return to using it. So I'm going to turn the opacity down somewhat, and I'm just going to start laying in some forms that will be the distant kind of mountains. Remember, this is on a layer above, so I'm not going to damage the sky detail that I've already created. I've also not got the brush on full opacity, so whenever I go over an area, it's going to create this sort of broken texture, which is going to be important because I'm going to start adding some sort of snowy areas and texture onto these forms, because they're going to be pretty high up, so it seems appropriate that you would have quite a textured kind of finish to it. So the fact that I haven't got it on full opacity and need to go over these areas to keep filling them in is just going to create quite a useful texture to perhaps imagine features on the broken sort of surface of snow and things like that. So I used a kind of smaller brush for the edges just to get that kind of sharpness, and now I've increased the size of the brush just to extend that colour down somewhat, because this is going to be largely covered by other features anyway, so I'm extending that colour down a bit. I'll reduce it again, start to just go over some of these forms, some of this edge. Okay, so it's still remaining quite textured at this point. I'm going to come back to that again later on, but I'm going to create another layer. And on this layer, I'm going to use the third colour. Now I've got a second blue there because that's going to be used to sort of go over some of the texture in those mountain areas. But the next colour along is going to be on a fresh layer, and this is going to be a more foreground mountain range. I'm going to turn the opacity of this one up because I really want it to overlap the background and not be transparent, obviously. So I'm bringing it in like this. I'm going to turn the size of the brush up. I'm going to allow it to really fill this area. Just sharpen up the edge a little bit. Like so. I've also got another colour selected here, which is like a more of a blue grey. Again, you don't have to guess at these colours. The colours are provided below. So if you really want to, get an exact copy of the colour scheme that I'm using here, then please feel free to, if you use Procreate, to use the hexadecimal codes. Now you can see I'm using this more bluey colour to add sort of texture into this land area. Again, it's not on full opacity, so I'm getting a bit of overlap of brush marks that I'm making, and I'm happy for it to do that for this stage. Sometimes I like to work quite flat and not have too much texture and details, but I want a lot more kind of feeling of stuff going on in the details of this one. I don't necessarily want to have to very accurately draw minor details, because that can really take a long time, but I want to hint at them with the texture. And sometimes it's just enough to do something like this quite quickly, sit back, look at some of the texture that's already there, and you might start to get a feel for something there. And rather than going straight over it without stopping and looking at it, you can really benefit from just seeing what the texture is doing for you already without you doing any work. So again, I'm going to use this to fill in the sort of bottom area. This is going to be subject to a lot of refinement after I've blocked in the main kind of forms and the main layers. So I'm not too worried about the neatness at this exact point. The devil is going to be in the kind of fine-tuned detail. Okay, I think this area is going to be covered by the next layer of land mass. But even already, I think you're starting to get a sense of the distance. And largely speaking, that's because of the colour choices. If you have the right colours selected, which is why I'm providing the hexadecimal codes, if you have the right colours in use, then the sense of distance kind of paints itself with the right colours, which is really good. So I'm going to create another layer. I will go back to this layer, obviously, and add more detail, but for the moment, I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to skip some of those colours. I'm going to go to the more vibrant ones that are here at the bottom row. Now, the reason that they're more vibrant looking, you can see the greens there, the much more kind of lush colours, is because you don't get the atmospheric changes that sends things more blue in the distance. These are more foreground, so it hasn't got the atmosphere making it more bluish. So the greens are much more vivid green in the foreground. So I'm going to start with this second green actually. I will return to the lighter green, but I think that this green is perhaps going to be useful just to lay in the kind of darker tone first. So I'm going to have the land sort of cutting in here, probably cutting across, up here like this maybe. Again, I'm not too bothered about detail straight away, because there's going to be lots of features on here. I'm going to do some trees and sort of texture on the grass area as well, like this. Okay, so then what I can do is then I can go to the lighter green, turn the size of the brush down, turn the opacity down quite a lot, and then just start to go over it and just allow a sort of texture to emerge by being quite rough, quite loose with the forms. Like I say, I do prefer using airbrush. I don't really tend to get too invested in different kind of textured brushes, but I know for some people that's a really useful thing to help create effects. And if that's something you enjoy doing, then you might find at this stage having particular kind of brush is really useful. It's just not something I've spent a great deal of time investing in. And to be fair, I quite enjoy drawing all the little details. When I get really engrossed in a painting, it's no effort for me to manually draw those little details because I'm absorbed and I'm enjoying it. But I can understand why people perhaps feel that manually doing texture and all those little details is a bit too time consuming and want to get somewhere a little bit more rapidly. But that's not typically the way that I work, so I will do things pretty manually. So I'm changing the direction of the brush marks, therefore it's creating overlaps of texture. but it's still pretty rough at this stage. I'm not too bothered about that. Okay, I'm going to create yet another layer. I'm going to go to my colours, and I'm going to go to this darker colour. It's a very dark kind of green, and I'm going to use this on a smaller brush. I'm going to start drawing some trees in. So I'm going to imagine that they are originating from over this mound. So you'll see the top half of them, or the top section of the trees. So I'm just going to follow along the line here. Maybe as we come over here we'll get bigger versions. We'll see. Maybe a more foreground one here. So we'll see the trunk a bit more clearly. And I'm just doing the texture, sort of having like a swinging motion here that gets gradually bigger as it goes down. And that's quite an effective way of creating the look of sort of pine. But you won't see this unless it's a much more closer to tree anyway. And then, because I don't want it too uniform, I can just go over it and just block in, make the forms a bit more random looking. And also it's going to merge at the bottom with any other trees and shrubs and things like that that happen to be making it more dense in this area. So it's only really the top section that you're going to notice some of those branches and textures anyway. I'm going to turn the size of the brush down slightly. It's fine from a distant view, but when I do zoom in on this painting, you're going to see it's quite rough. So I'm showing you the effect. I'm not necessarily taking it to the nth degree. I mean, that's something that if you choose to do in your spare time, that's great. If you get really absorbed in a piece, you can spend hours with it. But really, this tutorial, or this painting that I'm doing for the benefit of the tutorial, is going to take me about 50 minutes typically. So I have to keep it quite rough, and also I think it's as well just to teach people the kind of basic structures. I think that's more important than the fine detail anyway. So I'm going to have some more trees here, maybe denser trees. I'm changing the lay of the land a little bit. I'm going to cut it short a little bit sooner than I initially thought. No particular reason for that, I just changed my mind. Again, there's no right and wrong for this kind of thing. You might decide you want to do a completely different arrangement of trees. The shape of the land could be different. Like I say, it's more about if you use the right kind of colours and right effects, then the rest of it is something you can change and it can still look very effective. So I'm going to do some more trees up in this area, maybe a larger bank of trees even, so it could be a large mass of trees. If I just start to block in some of those kind of shapes, maybe at the top here, I'm going to turn the size of the brush down to more of a sharp, precise sort of point. I'm just going to spend a moment just sharpening up the edges, this sort of top of the trees. I think I'm going to decide to have a few trees that sort of are more spaced out here so you can see in between them. So I'm just creating a sort of variety of different spikes and features that appear on the top here. I did it with quite a large brush initially, so I'm just spending a moment or two just creating some slightly finer detail for that top edge, because I guess if the top edge is looking a bit better and a bit more refined, then it sells the illusion quite effectively. You don't need to do every detail, but sometimes a few details that look quite sharp and quite laboured on sells the illusion that the whole thing is really detailed. Okay, I'm going to switch to a more vibrant green that I've got on the range of colours here, and I'm going to turn the opacity down, but I'm just going to use it to create a sense of some highlights in these trees, because you're going to get the effect of the green in some areas, perhaps just along the edge of some of the trees. It's going to pick up the light a little bit and you'll see some of that green creeping in. Again, I'm keeping that quite rough, not getting too hung up on all the details. Okay, so I'm going to use on this layer, in fact I'm going to go back to the layer underneath, which was for the grass, and I'm going to use the green that I was just using then to start adding some sort of textures, some tufts of grass in areas, just to make it look more refined, more detailed. Maybe use some of the forms that are starting to appear anyway, and just take your cue from that. I deliberately left it quite textured. So I can use a combination of the shadow here, but I can also use some highlights on it as well. So I can go back to the paler green, and perhaps just on the top edge of some of these forms I can just help the illusion that they are more 3D forms that stick up, just with a top edge highlight. Again, I'm not labouring it, just a slight hint of it, that's enough. Okay, I'm going to go back to the mountain somewhat now, because roughly speaking, this is the general composition that I was looking for. So now I'm going to spend some time adding some more details. So I'm going back to the beginning, well, not quite the beginning because I started with the sky, but I'm going back to the beginning land formation, and I'm going to start adding in some extra features there. I've got a pale blue and I've got a dark blue, and I've got some extra colours here as well. I'm going to start just finalising some of those shapes and forms. I will also use perhaps the colour up here, which is the whitest colour I was using for the sky, but it perhaps is going to be useful for adding kind of snow features as well. So I'm looking at some of the textures that happened almost accidentally, and I'm taking my cue off of those. I'm going to see where naturally there seems to have been some paler areas anyway, and I'm just going to push them a little bit further, make them even paler. So I'm allowing the textures to become quite separated at certain areas, and then in other areas, especially closer up, maybe they become a bit more tightly packed together, a bit more clustered. But as they go further down, perhaps the snow becomes more separated. You don't get a tightly packed area of snow anymore. So in effect, I'm doing kind of the opposite. If anyone used to watch sort of Bob Ross tutorials, then you'll know that he relied on the actual sort of knife work, brushes to create some of this texture, and I'm doing it manually. I allowed the sort of overlapping of the translucent, transparent layers of brushwork to sort of create some of that texture, but it's a very different process, very different technique than with traditional materials really. I mean, you're still drawing it literally on the screen, or in a similar way that you manually apply to a canvas, but it's not paint in the traditional sense, obviously. And so different kind of techniques work. Some things aren't really replicatable, not yet anyway. So I'm going to imagine there's more light coming from this side, so I'm going to really exaggerate the light and the whiteness of the snow on this part of the mountains. It's not to say there isn't features on the other side, but they're just not going to shine as white and as brightly as they will on this side. So maybe if I turn the opacity down, I can then use the same white, but adding more subtle textures into this area. So it could be the same kind of things that features on this part of the mountains, but because it's more in shadow, then you've got a much more dim kind of white. And then as it gets down to more in the lower areas here, maybe it just sort of softens up so you don't see as much detail. Again, we've worked on layers for a reason, so now I don't have to worry about going over these trees because they're on a upper layer, so anything I do at this point isn't going to damage those trees. I'm just going to move on to the next layer that I worked on, this one. I'm going to go to the appropriate colours too. So I had a darker blue. I'm going to use that just to do some slightly sharper details on this layer. So maybe down here we have some more distant sort of banks of trees here, like a forest, but a much more distant one. So I'm creating a bit of a sense of tree tops perhaps, but they're going to be very small by comparison because they're much more distant. I can also take this lighter colour and really fine tune where I want it to be. Again, if I really wanted to focus in and add more detail, I would zoom in. I've got the whole tutorial on a zoomed out view, just so I can give you the constant sense of the whole picture as I'm adding details. When I do work on my actual own paintings, I will constantly zoom in and out, but that doesn't necessarily help the viewer, so I'm just trying to show you the general structure and the format in a completely zoomed out mode. Okay, if I wanted to make some minor adjustments here, I've not really accounted for this in the colour palette, but I can take the colour that I'm using there, make a slightly darker version, and I can use that just to add some slightly darker kind of suggestions of more texture into this area, this in the distance as well. But I don't want to overdo it. It doesn't require a whole different colour, it's just basically a slightly darker version of this blue, so it doesn't look quite so flat in the distance. There's a sense that perhaps there's lots of trees and texture there as well. Just a hint of it can go a long way. I'm going to go to the more foreground layer again. I'm going to do a bit more of that fine tuning with the dark colour. Maybe there's some shrubs and things here, some extra details that I'm not going to, again, do very accurately. Just a sense that something is here as a feature. It looks a bit empty. And I'm going to continue to add some of these sort of more foreground tufts of grass. So as it gets closer to the viewer, then you'll see more of this broken kind of texture even more. I'm just going to the lightest green that I've got here. Maybe use it to just redefine some of these edges. They are on kind of mounds, so they will probably catch the light the most. So I can afford to give a brighter, sharper kind of look to the edges of some of these in areas. Keeping it quite painterly, if you like. It's almost more like an impressionist kind of a painting. Maybe it doesn't look it on camera, but if you were to see it firsthand here, then it looks a lot looser really. So I'm happy with that as an effect anyway, I'm not too bothered. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time refining, sharpen up some of the areas of cloud as well, and see where we're at after that. Okay, I'm going to leave this particular piece at that point. It could be refined further, but I'm relatively happy with the overall effect. If you like this tutorial, please make sure to press the bell notification button next to the subscribe button on my page. I'd like to say a huge thanks to those people that supported me over at my Patreon page as well. If you want to find more information about that, there is also a link for that down in the description. Otherwise, please come back next time I do a tutorial. Keep checking back because I really appreciate all the support that I can get. Thanks very much for watching. See you later.